Howdy hey, today I'm gonna teach you how to center your clay on the wheel and throw a mug. Oh goodness. I think it's really important to learn how to throw a cylinder or throw like a mug shape before we learn how to throw a bowl, because it's a lot easier to turn like a cylinder into a bowl than turn a bowl into a cylinder. So it's a good place to get started. We're gonna walk through everything you need to get started on the wheel, setting up the pottery wheel, centering the clay, and then finally throwing your mug. I know it's a lot of steps, but it'll be worth it. So let's get started with preparing our clay. Oftentimes when people think about getting their clay prepped for the wheel, they think about wedging the clay. And sometimes that's necessary and sometimes it isn't. We'll talk about why. So wedging the clay is a process of creating a consistency within the clay. Meaning if portions are too dry or too wet, that will kind of like integrate the clay into itself to make it more of a consistent texture inside. Another reason that you would wedge your clay is to quote unquote wake up the clay. Some clays like porcelain, as they set, get a little bit harder, and so by wedging the clay you kind of like wake up the plasticity in the clay and make it all squishy again. This stoneware doesn't really have that problem, and a lot of other clays don't. So often if you're just pulling clay right out of the bag, you don't need to wedge it other than to get it into the shape that you want. So if I really wanted to, I could just smack this into a ball and it's all ready to go. However, let's talk about wedging just in case. When wedging your clay, it's kind of like kneading dough. However, rather than folding it in on itself, you're actually pushing the clay into itself. So I press with the heel of my hand, and then I pick up the clay and push the clay into itself like so. I'm not trying to fold the clay because that would put air bubbles into it. Rather, I'm trying to have all of the clay touch the porous surface that I'm wedging on to kind of even things out. It would look something like this. There's a couple different ways to wedge that make fun shapes. I'm wedging with ram's head or bull nose style wedging. Another way is called spiral wedging, and it kind of looks like a conch shell or like the magic conch from SpongeBob. I like to recommend to my students that they start with a piece of clay that's about the size of an orange, which is just about 2 pounds of clay. Another thing about getting started is you don't want to prep just one piece of clay. You want to prep 3 or 4, because as you're learning to center, you're gonna lose a couple pieces of clay, and that's totally fine. So rather than getting up and trying to prep clay and wedge it all over again, just do the work ahead of time. It's like meal prepping. Now that we have our clay prepped, let's go ahead and head over to the wheel. Alrighty, so what do we need in order to get started on the wheel? The things that I have with me are a towel that I drape over my leg here, a bat that attaches to the wheel on these 2 little pins, a bucket of like slightly warmer than lukewarm water. It's just easier on your hands. And then Walter. Walter is my keeper of the tools. He's a nutcracker mug that is so caked in clay that you cannot distinguish his features, and I love him. Anyway, Walter is holding a few important tools for us. Number 1 being a needle tool, a wooden knife tool, a wire, a sponge, and then a wooden rib and a metal rib. Now you don't need all of these tools in order to get started on the wheel, but I can link a few down in the description that are not sponsored links, but just ones that I recommend. Alrighty, let's get started. Before we slam our clay down on the wheel, I want to take a moment and ask for you to take a deep breath, because throwing on the wheel is not something that you get the first time around. Unless you are some like magical wizard, which, incredible, amazing, do it. I don't want to discourage you at all. I just want to go into this process with the expectation that we might not get a piece for the first couple times that we throw. And that's amazing, because throwing on the wheel and doing art is all about practicing vulnerability and just experimenting with trying something new. With that out of the way, let's talk about getting your clay stuck to the wheel. In order for clay to stick to the wheel, we need to make sure that our hands, the clay, and the surface of the wheel, whether you're throwing on the wheel head or on a bat, are completely dry. Sometimes people will take like a finger of water and just kind of like smear a little bit of water to help stick the clay, but I don't really find that necessary at all. However, if your hands or the bat is wet when you try to stick the clay, it'll end up just like sliding off the wheel and like hitting your neighbor or something, I don't know. Another thing to keep in mind is I want to start out with my clay being as round of a shape as possible. If I try to throw with like just a square that I cut off of the wheel, it's gonna be really difficult to get our hands around and to center. So by creating a ball like this or a cone shape, it's gonna make it a lot easier on us as we get started. I'm gonna take my clay and I'm just gonna kind of like slam it down on the wheel as close to the center as I possibly can. If I notice that the clay is not in the center of the wheel, I can pick it up and try to slam it down again. But the closer that we can get this piece to center before we start working, the easier it's gonna be on yourself. This is also the only time that I'm gonna tell you to touch the clay without the wheel moving before we're completely done with the piece. In order to make sure that your piece of clay is really stuck onto the wheel head, I'm gonna have you dip your hand in the water and create a little bit of a water seal by putting your finger down at the bottom close to the bat, like so. That makes a suction cup so that the piece is really stuck onto the wheel, but also it gives our pinky somewhere to rest as we begin centering the clay like this. When throwing on the wheel, friction is your enemy, meaning I want to make sure that my hands are extra wet, and so is the piece. If at any point in the process the clay starts to feel sticky or it hurts a little bit, or if there's any sort of heat, then go ahead and just, that's how you know you're gonna need more water. So we're gonna start off by getting my hands super wet and getting the piece super wet as well, like this. Before we bother our pretty little minds about centering the clay, let's talk about coning. When somebody who's never thrown on the wheel before gets started with spinning the wheel and holding onto the clay can kind of like push them around and bully them, so it can be a little bit of a jarring start. It can be very fun, but let's go ahead and just practice holding the clay in place. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get my stool and I'm gonna get it as close to the wheel as possible and try to get my hips as close as possible to the wheel as well. Then I'm gonna make sure my hands are wet and I'm gonna start the wheel almost at full speed, and I am just going to grab onto the clay on either side like this. While I recognize that it was really smooth for me, but that's because I have many years of practice. Like there are some beginning students who are like, whoa, get pushed around all the time. So this is a great point just to practice to hold the clay. I like to call this gathering the clay for beginning students. It's also called coning. When you add pressure to either side and pull slightly up, and you create sort of a cone shape with the clay. What comes up must come down. Meaning now that we've like coned our clay up, we get to push it down. What I normally do is I use both of my thumbs on the top of the piece. Sometimes I'll use the heel of my hand. But by supporting on the sides and just pushing the clay down, we get it back to where we started. Coning the clay serves a very similar purpose as wedging the clay. It wakes up the particles, and it also helps create an even consistent texture inside the clay. If you find that as you get started, your clay is like really dry, then coning water into the piece, it'll make it a little bit easier to work with. It also helps get the clay closer to center, so it makes our next step a little bit easier. Let's talk centering. When throwing on the wheel, let's think about our hands as two parts of one tool, meaning they're gonna work together in order to get this thing centered. With my right hand, I'm gonna bring my fingers together like this, and I'm going to set the side of my hand on the bat and bring it close so that I'm touching the clay. When I touch the clay, I don't wanna wrap my hand all the way around the piece. Rather, I want to hinge my fingers to my palm like this and set that triangle right next to the clay. This is going to act as the steady form that keeps our clay in check while we're getting it centered. With our left hand, we're gonna do the exact same thing. Bring our fingers close together and use this fleshy part of our hand, and we are going to chop down on top of the clay like this. We're gonna use our hand to push the clay down into this form. This hand is going to move the clay, and this hand is going to keep the clay steady. I'm going to bring my left hand down and my right hand in, so the motion will look like this. Hard to do in the air. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy, but it's easier on the clay. Now, this next part, while it looks like we're using our arms to put the clay into center, you're gonna find it a whole lot easier to use your whole body in order to get this clay centered. Meaning, I want to engage my core by pushing my elbows up against my stomach or against my legs so they're anchored. That way I'm not just like trying to muscle this clay into center. Another way that you can use your body to help center the clay is by leveraging your body weight. As I'm pressing my hand down onto the top of the clay, rather than just like using my arms and pushing it, what I'm gonna do is take a deep breath and lower my shoulders onto the piece like this. You can also leverage your body by pulling back with your right hand and leaning back in your chair, pulling it into center like so. This doesn't have to be an arm strength thing. So let's put that all into practice. I know it was a lot of information. So I'm chopping down on top with the fleshy part of my hand while bringing this triangle into center like this. So I'm going to straighten my back, bring these two together, take a deep breath, and lower my shoulders onto the clay like so. Now, this may take a few times in order to get the piece centered, so what you'll do is gather it up or cone it up again, and then try again. You'll know that your clay is centered when it runs smoothly through your hands and there's no like wibble wobbles or anything like that. Please give yourself grace in this process because it takes a long time to learn how to center like I just did. Feel free to go back and watch the first part of this video over and over again until you feel confident in centering. Then we'll move on to the next part. In order to open up the clay, I'm gonna get the wheel moving at a slow rate like this, and I'm going to use my thumb to open up the clay, though some people use their middle finger or their index finger to do this. There's a lot of right answers in clay, so you'll find what works best for you. But I'm going to find the center of my clay, and I'm going to slowly press my thumb into the center like this, making like a donut shape. Then I'm going to bring my thumb closer to my fingers like this, just to open up the clay a little bit. We're gonna take a needle tool and we are going to press the needle tool down through the bottom of the clay so that it touches the bat. Then I'm going to use my finger and I'm going to touch the bottom of the clay and pull out, and that is going to be how thick my bottom is. I press the needle tool down into the clay, touch the bottom of the piece, and then pull it out. And I know that that's how thick the bottom of my piece is, which is pretty great. When you're first getting started throwing, you should look for the bottom of your piece to be around the thickness of your pinky or a little over 1/4 of an inch thick. Like I said before, we're gonna get started with throwing a cylinder because it's easier to turn a cylinder into a bowl shape than turn a bowl into a cylinder shape. So we're gonna start out with our mug form. Remember, our hands are 2 parts of one tool, so we're gonna bring back that principle into this next part of the process. To pull up the walls of my form, I'm going to touch my thumbs together like a little butterfly, push up and push down at the same time to create a little bit of tension. And then I'm going to put one hand on the inside of the form and the other on the outside. I like to use my middle fingers to compress the walls and pull up. Some people use their index finger and their middle finger, or just their index finger. You're gonna find what works best for you. A lot of people think that when they're pulling up the walls of their piece, they're just gonna squish and they're gonna keep squishing all the way up because that's what it looks like in all of those Instagram and YouTube videos, right? But that's actually not the case. What's actually going on is we are going to squish just at the very beginning and establish a distance between our fingers. Then the rest of our pull is concentrating on not moving that distance between our fingers at all until we're not touching the clay anymore. That's gonna look something like this. One finger goes on the inside of the piece, one finger goes on the outside. We're going to squish ever so slightly, and then I'm just gonna bring my fingers up. I'm moving as slow as I possibly can with my hands until I'm not touching the piece anymore like this. Then after every pull, we're going to compress the top of our clay like this to make sure it stays even. And I do that by pinching the walls and then just like making a little tabletop or an A shape right on top. And that's really all there is to it. We're just gonna keep doing that process over and over again until it's as tall and as thick as we'd like it to be. So compress just at the very beginning and then slowly, slowly, slowly move your fingers upward. If your clay starts to be super wobbly as you're doing this, that's probably because you're moving your hands a little bit too fast, or you're creating inconsistent pressure with your fingers. Throwing on the wheel is really similar to learning a sport or an instrument. We're using the very tips of our finger as if the bone is pointing straight out of our fingers rather than the soft pads of our hands. This gives us more control over our pulls. And there we have a cylinder. If you want to be done here, amazing. You can pull this off, attach a handle, and it's going to be a great mug. But let me share with you how to create create a little bit of funkiness with your shape. There are a few ways that we can alter the shape of our mug, one of which is called collaring, and the other one is called bellying out. Collaring makes the piece a little bit skinnier in a certain part, and bellying out makes it a little bit wider. So let's start with bellying out our piece to make it a little bit more thick. I'm gonna get my hand wet, and I am going to put my hand inside of the piece like this. Supporting from the outside, I am just gonna slowly push my hand out and scoop the clay into a round shape. Then, collaring the piece will look like getting both of our hands wet and compressing from the outside very lightly like this. You can combine these processes multiple times to create like an extra funky shape. Experiment with these two things because you can create so many really awesome different shapes of pieces. This is when some of our other tools come into play. I'm gonna take my metal rib and I'm going to get some of this excess water and slip off of the outside of my piece. I'm gonna do this by very lightly skimming across the surface with the rib. You see how the slip kind of gathers on the rib like this? You can do this to just get the slip off of the sides of your piece, but you can also make this a little bit more of a decorative element. Then normally I take my wooden knife tool like this, and I'm gonna cut off just a little bit of the excess clay near the bottom of the piece. This is gonna make it easier for the wire tool to go underneath, as well as making it easier for us to trim the piece later on. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to point my wooden knife tool and slowly insert it into the clay until I'm touching the bat like this. Just taking off a little bit of clay. Now that we're done with our piece, let's talk about how to get it off of the wheel. I'm going to take my wire tool, wrap it around my fingers, and use my thumbs to push into the bat like so. And as I'm pushing inwards, I'm gonna pull the wire tool near me like this. Then, if the sides of my piece are dry, and my hands are, that's why we have our towel, I can just lift the piece up like this. Just directly up. I sometimes dump out the little bit of water that's there. Then you can place your piece on a bat like this. And there we have it. Here is our finished cylinder or mug form. Again, give yourself so much grace and patience in this process because it takes a long time to be able to throw well on the wheel. You don't have to get a finished product out of an experience in order to make it worthwhile and fun. In order to finish this piece up and make it into a mug, we're gonna wait till it's leather hard and trim it, then attach a handle, then fire and glaze, all of that jazz. But for now, we just get to celebrate the fact that it is, and it is done for now. Thank you so much for watching this video on how to throw it on the wheel. If you like learning about pottery with me, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we're going through all sorts of amazing different lessons and projects with clay. So if you watch this video and it's helpful, post a picture of what you made and use hashtag Benjamin Taught Me, and I love to check that out and see what y'all are up to. If you want even more pottery and art content, make sure you're following on all of the social media platforms. My name is Benjamin Cahoon. And if you want the inside scoop, what's going on behind the scenes, then make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter at benjamincahoon.com. I hope to see you all later. Harry. Oh goodness.